So some games nowadays have got massive and crazy GPU want. The minimum specs are getting higher and higher, with things like RTX 3060s going from a luxury to kind of needed in some cases. But I am personally of the opinion that if you're doing it carefully and you're doing it right, computer building and a good gaming computer can be cheap. And what is honestly one of my favorite cards, because it is the first card I ever started on, and I honestly still think it holds up today in my opinion, is the GeForce GTX 1050 Ti. It is the younger sibling to the far more popular 1060, but had a few more benefits, like while this one's a full card and requires a 6-pin, there are ones like this one, which was my first ever graphics card, which is low profile, as well as has no additional power requirement. And so today, I want to give it a crack. I've tested 1650s and 3060s, but honestly, even something older like a 1050 Ti, which in Australia, which is where I am, you can get for under $100 AUD. Is it a good budget card if you're just strapped for cash? So while I do have both of these GTX 1050 Ti's, I'm actually going to run this one because it doesn't have that power requirement and it really exemplifies a 1050 Ti. I'm trying to be completely fair to it, but the performance between the two isn't going to be very different at all. But I'm going to make sure that this GPU is not bottlenecked. And so I'm going to be testing it in my main machine. It has a Ryzen 7 5800X, 64 gigs of DDR4 memory, 3600 megahertz, Samsung 990 Pro for the SSD, few other bits and pieces, X57 motherboard. Currently, it's running an RTX 4060 Ti, obviously being switched out. So bottlenecking is not at all going to be an issue. And so what I'm going to do is now chuck it into the PC and get ready to benchmark. Card is now in the computer and operational. I will be recording on the computer for all the testing, but using a software encoder so as to hopefully not affect the GPU, but it will probably inevitably drop it a little bit, but I stand by it'll still be an impressive showing. The GPU is now in. So before we start, I want to talk a little bit about my experience with these cards, because I've actually had a lot of experience with the 1050 Ti, funnily enough. With first of all, having the laptop still in there, still in storage. My first ever laptop, which was a Dell Inspiron, had a mobile 1050 Ti in it. And back in the day, I was able to run a HTC Vive off that, as well as the exact 1050 Ti we are testing. I got that years ago, which is that 1050 Ti is one of the things that inspired me to get into computers. I had saved up, as a young kid, I saved up a long time, got one of the first HTC Vives because I tried VR once and just loved it. Saved up for months. Got there and I couldn't use it because my home computer was running a GT 630. My parents, being the loving parents they are, wanted to solve this. So we got a computer technician in and he was working at my house, which I got to see the insides of the computers, which was one of the first things that got me interested. And he did a bunch of research because he'd never touched a VR before. He was an older fella and ended up setting us up with a 1050 Ti, which was more than enough for us to run some VR. That exact 1050 Ti, which I still have to this day. That was also then in my first ever proper build that I built. I myself have had a lot of good experiences with the 1050 Ti, especially that exact one. If that one ever stops working, I'm going to be devastated. But that's why I really like this card, and I think it'll hold up today in 2024. But I guess that's what the testing is for. They can't really run a VR nowadays. It's just way not powerful enough. But oh well. But for how cheap they are nowadays, maybe they're a really good budget gaming option. With that, let's jump to testing. And now let's start some testing, starting with 3D Mark to do some benchmarking and then some games. So jumping into the testing of the 1050 Ti, I did a benchmark called Time Spy on 3D Mark, in which looking at just the GPU score, not the CPU. The GPU scored 2,139, which is not a bad score by any means. Not a great score, but not a bad score. And then let's move into some games. Portal 2 scored about 300 FPS consistently, which is pretty valid. It's an older game, so it makes sense. Moving on to another older game, just to test if it's competent at all, basically. I've got the Steam version of the original Doom, in which 250 FPS, while not breaking a sweat at 28%, so there was zero issue there. There was never going to be any issue there. Moving on to Assassin's Creed Unity is where we start to push a little bit. Assassin's Creed Unity is a more intensive game, but it's also a bit older. Good game, but it sits around 45 FPS with the GPU at 98%. And even though it's a low profile with a small heatsink and one little fan, no thermal issues at all, but all of its 4 gigs of VRAM is being used up, which shows why something like the 1060 might be a good idea. Moving on to a much more modern game like Baldur's Gate, again 99% with most of the RAM used up, but running a good 40 FPS, and considering that most of these will run on high or ultra, not necessarily the highest settings, but either high or ultra on every game, with Baldur's Gate being at the highest settings, pretty impressive FPS. Because while these are all at 1080p, if you're building a budget machine, a lot of people are okay going to lower settings in order to get a better game experience. Moving on to Titanfall 2, on a far more intensive part of the campaign, It clocked around 60 FPS with, again, very high settings. Moving on to Sea of Thieves Last. This was one of the only times we saw it on 98% and not using up all of the VRAM. And again, about 60 FPS on high. So some very good settings. Modern day, it just doesn't have enough VRAM. It's still very competent gaming card, but it could definitely benefit from extra VRAM. But clearly the scores are not bad. If you're building something with a 1050 Ti in 2024, you're not necessarily looking for ultra settings. For 1080p medium settings, this can more than game. Maybe not your cyberpunks and your intensive stuff, but it can play practically anything you want it to that's basic. And this is without even needing power supply requirements. That's pretty impressive. And so many years after its release, the GTX 1050 Ti with its 4GB of VRAM still proves that it is a capable gaming machine at 1080p. It's not the greatest, and more intensive AAA games it won't always run, but a bunch of games still fall into the minimum spec of a 1050 Ti. Even the new one, Helldivers 2 recently, which has been a big one, the minimum spec is only a 1050 Ti, this exact card. And so you'd be surprised what you can still do with old cards like these. People write them off too fast, in my opinion. They are cheap and they are still powerful enough for some gaming. You can get them pretty cheaply. The only caveat I'll talk about is you can get some better cards for similar pricings, like a 1060. The 6GB version is just always going to be better. A 1650 and a few other cards you can get at a similar price that are just better. But if you've either already got a 1050 Ti or there's one really cheap and you just want to do some basic gaming, not even light gaming per se, because things like Assassin's Creed will run, give it a crack. Anyway, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. I do a lot of tech stuff on this channel, whether it be from reviewing parts like this, doing tech challenges, a bunch of other stuff. Comment down below whatever GPU you're running. I'm curious, what do you run? I want to see what my viewers overall like to run. And I hope to see you in the next video. Please subscribe and like, it would help me out a ton. I'm a small creator, help me get out there a bit more. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.